Now for part 2 in this week's lecture regarding discrimination of racial and ethnic minorities in American society. In this lecture, we'll look at a few other populations, including Asian Americans, Muslim Americans, and a brief discussion of Native American issues once again. Asian Americans represent the fastest growing minority in the United States, and they come from many different countries and nations and see themselves as having very little in common with each other, much like the Latino population as well. Their economic success is due largely to their focus upon family life and is consistent with the socialization and community and educational achievements. It should be noted that while Asian Americans are often indicated to have a higher household income than even Caucasian Americans do, the majority group, one of the factors that contributes to that is the fact that several generations and several income-producing adults may live together in the same home. And so while it appears on the surface that they may be doing better, they probably aren't. In fact, it has been said also that Asian Americans have to have higher achievement in order to be assigned to specific positions in industry and in the educational environment. And so what a Caucasian American might need to have a master's degree in order to participate in, the Asian American will need to have a doctorate. And again, this is speaking in generalities, but this is often the case for this minority, which is referred to as a model minority. And that is to say that oftentimes when other minority populations are said to have lower income levels and not to be able to attain as high a status in American society, those in the majority oftentimes will point towards the Asian Americans and say, if they can do it, you can too. In fact, there's a lot of different reasons for this, as I just mentioned. This designation as a model minority sets Asian Americans up with other minorities to be the subject of some derision and rejection. While cultures included in the overall grouping of Asian Americans don't share language or common experiences, they do share the way that they are treated because of the way that they look. Incidents of anti-Asian violence are a part of the historical treatment of this population in America for over 200 years. The Chinese, who were welcomed in the 1800s during the gold rush and prior to that time, were excluded once the Transcontinental Railroad was completed and have been excluded by law from immigration for over 50 years. In 1982, Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese auto worker thought to be Japanese, was murdered in, I believe, San Francisco. And his murder was considered to be the birth of the pan-ethnic Asian American movement in the United States and helped to develop the movement to address issues of bigotry against Asian Americans. Vincent Chin, as I said, was a Chinese mistaken for a Japanese and was murdered by white co-workers in public. And those co-workers, in fact, were given very light sentences nonetheless. Now, this was during a time when the Japanese were, well, as I'll mention here in a moment, were the subject of some competition and prejudice because of their economic power, and particularly in the auto industry. The Japanese suffered discrimination resulting from these anti-Chinese sentiments as well. During World War II, of course, this population was interned due to their perceived threat as Japan's military power increased, even those Japanese who were born in America and who had family members who were serving in the armed forces. They were subject to the competition and prejudice as Japan's economic power grew, and have said to bring a reverence for work and a tradition of submerging the individual in the interests of the group that leads to their being seen as non-aggressive and agreeable. In Anchorage in the late 1980s or early 1990s, I remember large newspaper ads in the daily news by automakers deriding the purchase of Japanese vehicles and using that as a come-on to purchase American vehicles instead. There was some of that anti-Japanese sentiment in Alaska even then. Filipino migration began in the early 1900s, but mostly after 1924, when there was an agreement established with Japan that stopped the flow of Japanese immigrants. The gentleman's agreement was struck during the Theodore Roosevelt administration because individuals on the West Coast were becoming upset that the Japanese immigrants were taking too many jobs from the native residents on the West Coast. In San Francisco, in fact, the school board had, I believe, voted to put Japanese students into segregated schools because of the hostility that was being directed towards the Japanese. So Roosevelt and a Japanese immigration official and San Francisco school board members met together, and Japanese agreed to limit migration of their citizens to America in exchange for San Francisco being more inclusive of their Japanese students in the school system. When the availability of white workers increased during the Depression, the immigration of the population was also decreased for the Filipinos as well. So once again, they're wanted when we need them, and they're not wanted when they begin to take away jobs from the majority. When the immigration laws were revised in 1965 nationally, a second influx of more highly educated and skilled Filipinos immigrated to America, but they didn't develop their own ethnic enclaves for the most part as the Chinese and Japanese communities did, perhaps because of the need to do so because of the prejudice against those populations. Koreans began entering the United States around the early 1900s to escape war, famine, and disease. Largely, they worked in the lumber and farming industry along the West Coast, much as the Filipinos did. Asian Indians also came around the same time and wound up in much the same industries. Vietnamese, Laotian, Hmong, Thai, Burmese, and Cambodian refugees increased in number greatly with the fall of Saigon to the communists in 1975. And unlike others, many of these individuals brought their whole families with them and came to America from a wide range of socioeconomic backgrounds in their homelands. As I believe may have discussed earlier in the semester, the experience of the Southeast Asian immigrant varied widely depending upon their economic status, with the lower income Southeast Asians not faring very well in the overall picture. Government policy had many of them spread out around the United States at military bases, in refugee centers, and so on, until they were adopted by a community or a family somewhere else. These individuals oftentimes were adopted by church communities and other social service organizations that committed to providing them with assistance and support as needed and getting established in communities around the United States. So as a result of this, they really didn't form ethnic enclaves that have helped the Chinese and Japanese in terms of the mutual aid and support that those enclaves can present to the immigrant. This particular population of immigrants tends to have a higher rate of mental health problems, but are unlikely to seek out help from providers because of their cultural views of mental illness and, in general, the mistrust of authorities. Each of these groups brings different issues related to their different immigration experiences and the different resources available to them. Now we take a look at Muslim Americans in America. There is some evidence that suggests that Muslims were present on Christopher Columbus's ship when he arrived in the West Indies, but their first clearly documented arrival of Muslims in America occurred in the 17th century with the arrival of slaves from Africa. Scholars estimate that anywhere from a quarter to a third of the enslaved Africans brought to the United States were practicing Muslims. During the 19th century and into the 1920s, a large number of Arabs, mostly of Lebanese and Syrian descent, arrived in the United States. Most of these immigrants, maybe as much as 90% of them, were Arab Christians, but there were sizable groups of Muslims among them as well, and most of those individuals settled in the Midwest. At the time of the Great Migration of blacks from the South to the northern cities after the World Wars in America, African Americans began to rediscover their African Islamic roots. The reemergence of African American Islam has been a consistent phenomenon throughout the 20th century unto the present day. Today, African American Muslims constitute about a third of the American Muslim population. With the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, greater numbers of Muslims began migrating to America, along with many other immigrants with diverse backgrounds. This change in immigration laws allowed highly skilled professionals to enter the United States. Many of the Muslims that came here during this period of time were from the Middle East and South Asia. So you can see here that America has one of the most diverse Muslim populations in the world, including people from almost every ethnic group, every country, and every school of thought in the Muslim world. A third of them are African American, another third are of South Asian descent, about a quarter are of Arab or Middle Eastern descent, and the remainder are from other parts of the world, including a growing Latino Muslim population as well. Exact numbers are difficult to establish, but there's an estimate that between 3 and 6 million Muslims are Americans. About half of this population were born in the United States, and this, of course, is going to continue to grow as immigration slows and the younger individuals start having their own families. Even with a number as large as that, Muslim Americans still only constitute about 1% of the United States population. Mosques function as centers of social and political integration in the United States and are very important to the Muslim communities. In fact, mosques are often the subject of threats and terroristic attacks in recent years. Similar to other religions, attendance and religiosity has been shown to result in higher civic engagement and support for the core values of the American political system. This runs quite counter to the notion that individuals who practice the Muslim faith, the Islamic faith, are somehow bent upon identification as a terrorist and intent upon tearing down the American way of life. In fact, most Muslim Americans are already deeply engaged in the American way of life and participate fully in it. Islam is a religious tradition, and adherents to Islam are referred to as Muslim, but there is no one political platform, no agenda for those who practice the religion of Islam in the United States. Despite concerns that some Muslims support terrorism, religious leaders have said consistently that Islam strictly condemns religious extremism and the use of violence against innocent lives. There is no justification in Islam for extremism or terrorism. As already mentioned, the overwhelming majority of American Muslims are well integrated into our society and in fact report criminal activities to the authorities regularly. Over the past decade, 40% of domestic terrorist plots have been uncovered or deterred with the assistance from American Muslims. American Muslim leaders, educational institutions, and advocacy groups have repeatedly spoken out for freedom of expression and are actively involved in promoting religious liberty for all people, both in the United States and abroad. Yet right-wing bigots wring their hands and warn against the imposition of Sharia law if Muslims are allowed to continue to flourish in the United States. The Pew Research Center has reported in 2011 that while about a quarter of the general public thinks that Muslim support for extremism is increasing, only 4% of Muslims agree with that statement. And according to this study, for Muslims in the United States, concerns about Islamic extremism coexist with the view that life for Muslim Americans in post-9/11 America is difficult in a number of ways. 28% report being looked at with suspicion, and 22% report being called offensive names. 21% report being singled out by airport security, and another 13% say they've been singled out by law enforcement. Over half say that government anti-terrorism policies single out Muslims in the United States for increased surveillance and monitoring, and I would guess that since the imposition of travel bans by the Trump administration in subsequent years, that number has certainly increased. A quarter of Muslim Americans report that mosques or Islamic centers in their communities are the target of controversy or outright hostility, but still, they have not become disillusioned with this country. 82% are satisfied with the way things are going in their lives and continue to rate their communities very positively as places to live. 79% say excellent or good. Although we've spent more time speaking about Native Americans and Alaska Native previously, just a brief mention of them in the context of this particular discussion. 90 to 95% of that population was decimated in white American expansion to the west due to disease and war. This includes both lower 48 Native Americans as well as Alaska Natives. Perhaps more were killed than in the Holocaust of World War II. Government policy towards them is mostly exploitative and has been throughout our history. About half live in rural areas and about a quarter live on reservations. Poverty rate is the highest of all groups. Life expectancy lower than the national average, suicide and alcoholism higher than the national average by 4 or 5 times. Young male Alaska Native suicide rate is 5 times the national average. And their oppressive life circumstances and social and economic marginalization limit the future of the younger generation greatly. Again, I refer you to separate presentations on this population for more detail. Injuries suffered by individual victims of hate crimes go far beyond the physical wounds inflicted upon them, and that's why such crimes get special attention by the law enforcement community. The definition of a hate crime turns on the intent of the perpetrator and not the understanding of the victim. In that light, much attention is given to the motivations of the perpetrator of the crime. Hate crimes result in injury to the psyche, both individually and also to the entire minority community as well, and this has to be considered as to the severity of the crime. Unlike situations of victims of other crime, the perpetrator may be arrested, but there's really no escape possible for victims of hate crime, as they understand that they must live with the possibility of a reoccurrence of this without warning. In these cases, perpetrators are rarely caught, and victims, as a result, are stripped of their individuality and reduced to their race. So the consequences of hate crimes are considered to be more severe than other crimes. The responses to these crimes should be tailored to address the needs of the individual and of the particular community in which the crime occurs. The correct response can counter the messages that is given through the hate crime. Those are messages of exclusion and intimidation. It's been said that racism exists wherever it is claimed that a given social status is explained by a given natural characteristic. Social activist, author, and educator Elizabeth Martinez wrote that the United States refuses to see itself as one nation sitting on a continent with 20 others, all speaking languages other than English and having the right not to be dominated. The white-black bipolar model of racism that is so prevalent when we think about racism in America tends to divide groups of racial minorities against each other and results in the ineffectiveness of those minorities in challenging white supremacy. A mid-1990s Harris poll showed that peoples of color are prejudiced against each other. Blacks and Latinos have friction in cities such as New York City and Los Angeles, seen as the result of the power elite generating economic anxiety and generating the resentment, setting one community against each other. Latin peoples challenge American ideas of the duality of racism in their varying roots in indigenous Native American, European, and African cultures, and the mixing of peoples leading to the emergence of new peoples is likely the future of the United States culture, and white shall cease to be the national identity of the United States. So those are some thoughts for you as we consider the position of racial and ethnic minorities in the United States, and as we look to the future as well for our field of practice. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.